Hello, everyone, and welcome to OPA's Mercury Hour. Today, we have an excellent guest. She's going to be presenting about Pluto. Her name is Aerin Fogel, and she is a Toronto-based astrologer. She does core pattern tarot reading and practicing professionally since 2012. Aerin has spoken for Kepler College, San Francisco Astrological Society, the Canadian Astrology Conference, ConVocation, and Astrology Toronto. She has several appearances on the Astrology Podcast and blogs for the Mountain Astrologer. In 2025, she'll be sharing her work with ISAR, OPA, and the CAELi Review. She strives to work from an integrated, trauma-informed perspective, centering the uniqueness and gifts on all individuals. Aerin was also the occult consultant on The Craft, The Legacy, and plays her band, Queen of Swords. That's very exciting. I like your bio.
The new one, not the original one, but
Hey, man, that's awesome. That's really fun. I'm going to have to check that out. So, with all of that being said, welcome, Aerin. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Okay, so welcome to Seeing in the Dark. Rather than making this a very technical lecture and kind of giving you my idea of a list of meanings and associations, what I'd like for us to do instead is to weave together some stories that are going to allow you to form your own understanding of Pluto and the luminaries. And of course, if people in this Zoom room know that they have Pluto touching one of their luminaries or have been through a transit of that nature, then you already know very much what that's like through your own lived experience. So I've been inspired to do this talk through my own journeys with Pluto, but also because I feel that we've entered a time period in the world where I feel that we will do well to have some tools that support us in navigating the underworld. So today we're going to be exploring themes around light and darkness. We're going to be shining a light into the darkness, themes around visibility and invisibility, grief and loss, journeying through the underworld, birth and rebirth, and a few examples near the end of some incredible individuals who carry this mark in them. So, we will be touching on some challenging subjects. So please feel free to do what you need for yourself as we chat about some of the more difficult themes. And as we'll see from the stories, an understanding of Pluto and the underworld are almost more available through a kind of peripheral vision. Moving my slide down here. Here we go. Yeah, we can really almost touch the underworld a little bit better through peripheral vision rather than trying to stare directly at it or trying to overly grasp or quantify what it is. In fact, sometimes I find that actually keeps understanding out of our reach altogether. So I'd invite you to treat this conversation as a journey into the unknown or into a deep space within yourself, and not to worry about trying to get all the right notes and points out of it. And we can trust that the nature of this journey is to illuminate something that was previously cast in darkness. And so we don't yet have to know what that is or what that's going to look like. I'm much more interested in supporting a felt sense of your experience than like traditional pedagogy where I'm the teacher telling you information. And if anything, I would say that this particular subject is about letting go of our attachment to a particular kind of meaning. So I'd like to start off by talking about Apollo and Artemis, who in Greek myth were known as twins, and they were considered to be two of the most powerful gods and goddesses in Greek mythology. So if we are looking at Greek myth, which we often do when we're talking about astrology, there are a few characters that we could take to signify the sun and the moon. But for our purposes today, we're going to work with Apollo to signify the sun and Artemis to signify the moon. And so in our conversation today, we're thinking about the sun and the moon as the lights in the sky. So they are quite literally the two celestial bodies that illuminate the night and the day realm of our experience. So they're the two main sources of light in the sky. And so when we're approaching this conversation about Apollo and Artemis, we can think about their birth symbolically as a means of understanding or symbolizing the birth of light itself, as they represent the two lights or the luminaries, this sense of the emergence of light that's part of their birth. So in the myths, Apollo and Artemis were twin children of Zeus and Leto. And for some of you who might know a little bit about Greek myth, you might know that Zeus was actually married to the goddess Hera. But he was particularly known for having a wandering eye and being fond of affairs. So he has an affair with Leto, and Hera is understandably quite mad about that. So Hera curses Leto to not be able to give birth on solid ground as a kind of vengeance against, Zeus's dalliances. So Leto, pregnant with her children, is wandering all through Greece trying to find somewhere to give birth. And the people of Greece won't let her rest on their land because they fear the wrath of Hera. Finally, Zeus is like, okay, I'll help you. And he brings the island of Delos closer to the mainland so that Leto can land there and give birth. In Greek myth, there was also a goddess named Eileithyia, who was known as the goddess of childbirth. And so when one of the divinities was ready to give birth, Eileithyia would show up and she would attend their birth as a midwife. And so Hera has also in this story prevented Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, from attending this labor. So there's a question as to whether Leto will even be able to successfully give birth without that kind of support. So Artemis is born first, and she's actually born quite swiftly and easily. She comes out right away. But Apollo, who is born second, his birth becomes quite difficult, and there are delays and challenges with Leto being able to successfully birth him without the presence of Eileithyia. And so Artemis spends many days actually midwifing her brother's birth with her mother until he is finally delivered. And following their twin births, the island of Delos becomes a highly sacred island as these divine births took place there. So let's look at some of the meaning here. I think that even though this is a story about the birth of the lights or the luminaries, it contains an interesting seed of a kind of underworld journey in their birth. First of all, they are banished into some kind of invisibility in their birth story. There's something like a descent process where they are unwelcome on common ground and do not have access to the basic needs of a regular birth, such as the goddess or childbirth or, like stable ground underneath them. And this sense that they're literally not allowed on solid ground means that they're forced into a kind of descent process that is represented by the unstable floating island of Delos, as any descent process that we go through is inherently unstable and not on fixed ground. For Artemis, we see the great responsibility that's bestowed in this descent process, where she must use her wisdom and her gifts and her perceptions immediately upon being born into something like a crisis. She has to summon up her gifts intuitively and instinctually, attending to her mother and her brother with great care, which also indicates the intuitive and instinctual gifts of care that the moon symbolizes. For Apollo, there are delays in the process. It is longer and much more painful than might be expected, and a supportive guide is needed to safely midwife this journey. And this symbolizes also the seasonal nature of the sun, which cannot be rushed and will simply take the time that it takes. I live in Toronto, where a lot of people are wishing they could rush the winter season to its end. We've had a lot of snow, but the sun takes the time that it takes. And it also has the capacity to bless and bring light to whatever it touches in the horoscope, even in the hidden places. But we see in both stories this kind of persistence and inevitability of life, that the births will happen against all odds in miraculous ways, and the sense that life will find a way. So there's a promise here with the luminaries that light is going to find a way. One of the most distinct qualities of a Pluto transit that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is the notion of rebirth. So here we see the precarity or the danger and fear of a Plutonian type birth, which tends to hold no comfort as opposed to a more regular kind of birth. There's no promises, there's no guarantees. But then what blossoms forth into the world is some of the greatest light and gifts that we could ever receive. We can juxtapose this with a more regular birth experience, which might have greater comfort and security, but perhaps less divine and spectacular results. So I think that the birth of the luminaries is already an interesting symbol for this Plutonian journey that we're talking about. Now let's move to talking about Hades. And if we're to take Apollo and Artemis to symbolize the sun in this conversation, we would take Hades to symbolize Pluto. That's the traditional representation in Greek myth, although in earlier Egyptian tradition of astrology, Pluto would have been more connected with, say, Serapis or Osiris. So Hades is one of the children of Kronos, who was known for swallowing his children. There's lots of kind of famous, well-known stories about Kronos swallowing his children, and Hades is one of the early ones to go in. So we might say that Hades kind of grew up in a sort of underworld of being in Kronos's belly for a significant part of his life. Zeus, who is one of the later children of Kronos, eventually successfully leads the Olympians into battle against their father, sort of forcing his father to vomit up the children. And then they wage war on their father and the Titans, in which they are eventually successful. And the realms are then divided between the three brothers, Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon. Zeus takes the heavens, which is why he sits up there on Mount Olympus. Poseidon takes the seas, and Hades takes the underworld. So there's actually not that much about Hades in the Greek myths, as most of the favorite mythic stories tend to revolve around more sort of like heroic, feel-good, heaven-centered type tales. As the ruler of the underworld, Hades is maybe not someone that people loved thinking about or telling stories about. He was more a figure to be both feared and revered. Persephone's abduction is likely one of the most well-known stories involving Hades, but we're going to try to look at some other perspectives today because I didn't feel that that was quite the right story for this conversation. Hades himself is an overseer of this place of the dead, which is essentially what the underworld is. So he oversees this realm where the souls go after they've separated from their bodies or after they've died. But he is not himself responsible for the dead. That's more the work of the Furies. So it's an interesting symbol that he's in charge of this realm of death, but not himself, the bringer or the sort of enforcer of death. I'm perhaps more interested in the allusion to the underworld that's part of Greek myth, or the sort of hint or mystery of Hades' presence, again, then trying to look directly at what it is. So the underworld itself is also largely absent from most myth. It tends to appear only in these critical moments as something that catalyzes the next stage of the journey, or as something that is referenced, or as a kind of necessary place to be visited in order to then be able to move forward with the next stage of one's experience. But very little direct story is actually attributed to the underworld or Hades himself. And so I think from this, we can understand that The underworld is not meant to symbolize regular everyday life or stability, but it's more of like a presence, a reference point, a kind of catalyst, or an aspect of some greater cycle. So here's an image of the underworld, and this is Charon, the ferryman who takes the souls over to the underworld on the river Styx. In myth, the underworld itself is often actually called Hades, so making the ruler and the place itself synonymous with one another. And in the stories, the underworld is generally reached through caves or water. That's how you enter. And so it gives us this sense of, cave-like places in our being and in our experience, like the dark or depressive places. It's entered through water, which is the deep well of feeling and emotion. So we enter the underworld through these deep, dark, and extremely feeling places that we must go through in order to then reach the deeper places of consciousness that live underneath. In the myths, there are souls that get stuck and they wander up and down the river Styx, kind of neither here nor there. They're in this liminal space. And it's almost like if we're taking these bodies of water as feeling, the souls get stuck in the feeling itself rather than being able to kind of access the place underneath the feeling that tends to remain unseen. So the realm of Hades has three main regions to it. Tartarus is known as like the lowest and darkest place of kind of punishment, or where most souls go after they've died. Erebus is like the middle realm of Hades, that is a place for wandering souls. And then there's the Elysian Fields, which is reserved for those chosen by the gods. And in Greece, there was a profound annual mystery rite called the Eleusinian Mysteries. And this was an annual tradition that the Greeks performed where they would physically journey to what they referred to as Pluto's cave, and go through these deep initiatory processes that were meant to inspire a kind of spiritual awakening through being in relationship with death and Pluto's realm, and to petition the gods to have a more peaceful afterlife, essentially. Like everyone wanted to get into the Elysian Fields. And there are 5 rivers in the underworld as well. And what I find very interesting is that one is said to leave the underworld by journeying along the river of forgetting. And so this indicates this kind of like descent, like we descend through the rivers or through the feeling of our experience into the hidden place underneath. And then there's like a necessary forgetting process when we leave that also takes place. We have to forget in some way when we leave the subconscious realms, or when we leave those realms of our experience that are painful or often traumatic, in order to complete our underworld journey and return to regular life. So those beings who are not themselves of the underworld must have a guide with them in order to enter or exit. These are generally known as the psychopomps. You can't just like pay a visit. There are a few characters that do, and it doesn't go so well for them. So the psychopomps are a beautiful symbol for the way in which we need a guide or a trusted companion to journey into these deep and dark, difficult realms of experience. We're really not meant to go there alone. And to me, I think of the river Styx as kind of like what happens when we are there alone. Like there's a sort of wandering or a stuckness that can happen when we feel alone in these places. In a Pluto journey, it is often what cannot be spoken about or what we can't name directly that is most powerful. So, like the underworld in Greek myth, there's this promise or presence of it that we feel acutely, but it's often not referenced directly or even explicitly shown. These are the realms of our experience, that are more intense as a peripheral felt sense, which are different from the experiences that we tend to subjectively prefer, like the things that feel super nice or joyful in our lives. And this is like the felt sense of the underworld through the possibility of death or ruin in Apollo and Artemis's birth story that we looked at. Or, for example, when I think of, say, the Odyssey, for instance, Odysseus spends a year of pleasure on Circe's island with her, but then he must necessarily visit the underworld before he can start to journey home, meaning that he needs it as a kind of initiation to take his journey. And this gives us the sense that we often must visit Pluto's realms if we're going to recover and come home. It is necessary to initiate this process of what I would consider to be trauma healing and recover dissociated parts of ourselves that have become frozen through trauma. We might imagine that parts of ourselves simply get stuck down there in the underworld or stay wandering on the river Styx when we go through certain experiences. And the Pluto journey is one where we must go down and recover them, even if it means that something else has to die in the process. I find that it is often our defenses that die in that process, like the constructed sense of self that the sun signifies, or the habits of the moon. So there can be a kind of splitting effect in our experience, where our defenses are the ones that function by the light of day, and other parts of us remain stuck in the underworld where we can no longer see or feel them. In this kind of journey, we are going down there to retrieve them, to shed light on them, but we usually have no idea what's down there when we begin. I think it's also interesting to talk about Hades' helmet, which is known as the helmet of invisibility. Any wearer of this helmet becomes invisible to other gods and mythic beings. The helmet belongs to Hades, but in myth it is worn occasionally by other gods when needed, again in these kind of critical or catalyzing moments of the story. Like Hades and the underworld, the helm of Hades is alluded to in some stories, but is itself mostly invisible, often appearing simply as a catalyst in the story to propel the journey forward. From the helmet, we can make a kind of inference that in any Pluto journey or underworld journey, there is an invisibilizing, a removal of sight. This might be our own actual sight. I've worked with people who actually physically lose sight during Pluto transits. Or it may be a kind of sight where the pathway ahead becomes invisible as we descend into darkness. But it may also correspond to our visibility to the regular world, as if we slip below the surface of mundane reality and enter a realm that is not usually perceived in people's day-to-day experiences. So in this process, we are invisibilizing the mind and the cognitive perception. It's like making the eyes go dark so we don't see in the way that we usually see. We have to develop other forms of perception and attunement during this time. We can't rely on our ordinary senses. And then, of course, for people who have Pluto luminary aspects in their natal chart, this is also how they live. It's not so much a period of time as a way of being and existing in the world. So one really interesting element woven into most of these myths and much of Greek myth itself are the cyclopes. The cyclopes were cyclops-like beings. They were giants, so they were these kind of like huge, archaic beings that had one eye. And they're quite polarizing in the stories. They're usually either very helpful or very destructive. During the War of the Titans that I was mentioning earlier, it is actually the cyclopes that bestow these three critical tools to the three brothers who then win and divide the realms between them. So they give the thunderbolt to Zeus, the trident to Poseidon, and the helmet of invisibility to Hades that we were just talking about. And as we know, after the war, the realms get divided up between these three brothers, and the underworld is assigned to Hades and his invisibility helmet. So the Cyclopes, the givers of the helm, are already interesting for our purposes because they have one eye, and we're talking about light and vision here in this symbol. Traditionally, in astrology, we would take the sun and the moon to be the rulers of the eyes. So usually the sun is considered to rule the right eye, and the moon is considered to rule the left eye. And also, as I was saying earlier, they are what creates visibility in the sky. And so the Cyclopes with their singular eyes might indicate some merging or unification of solar and lunar capacities that also might indicate a limited or more singular vision, or perhaps even a lack of vision that we might associate with the underworld and the themes of invisibility there. I think it is also like a profound symbol that the Cyclopes, who see with this kind of merged vision, are the ones to create and bestow these critical tools that the Olympians use to succeed in battle. And it's interesting also that later in the myths, it is actually Apollo's son, Asclepius, who is killed by one of Zeus's thunderbolt. And so Apollo kills the Cyclopes in revenge as the originators of the thunderbolt, which to me is almost like a powerful symbol of Apollo as the sun, kind of trying to kill the origins of the tools of the underworld or negating its power, as death is something that is inherently disturbing to solar forces of life and generativity. In Apollo's birth story, he may represent the initiation of life, the striving for life to happen, that sense that it will happen at all costs, no matter how long it takes, signifying that life will find a way in any and all circumstances. And it's almost as if later killing the Cyclopes in his story is a way to break this link with death or this connection between the realms. Interestingly, I mentioned Odysseus earlier. He also initiates his journey of loss and underworldly process by killing a Cyclops in his story. Despite that act being itself a kind of desire to defy death, it's what actually sends him on the never-ending 10-year journey that it takes to get home. So perhaps the Cyclopes also tend to represent some allusion to the underworld realms of our experience, or the general aversion to them that's held in myth tells us something about our aversion to the Plutonian or perceived monstrous aspects of ourselves. So let's now talk a little bit about some of the symbols that are here and see where some of the connection lies in this underworld journey of the luminaries. Despite the notion that Apollo and Artemis seek to break the link to death and the instinct that the Cyclopes represent, there are many other mythic references, particularly for Apollo, that allude to actually a profound connection with death itself. The Cyclopes are also actually said to create the bows that Apollo and Artemis use for hunting, just as they created Hades' helmet, suggesting that their power, the power of the sun and moon, actually comes from the same source as the power of Pluto. And there's a kind of integration of these powers that happen within the Cyclopes, or perhaps an indication that even though their qualities are opposing, Pluto opposes the qualities of the sun and the moon, that there's some relationality between them. Both Apollo and Artemis also show a distant but distinct relationship with the underworld throughout the myths. Interestingly, Apollo governs tombs and cemeteries and is responsible for separating souls from their flesh at the time of their death. Apollo's daughter Eurydice, for those who know this story, is actually the one that Orpheus tries to rescue from the underworld. And that's a fascinating story for this in and of itself. Meanwhile, Artemis is known as the goddess of hunting, and hunting is kind of like a pursuit of death in its own way. After she stood at the threshold of life and death during her own brother's birth. And she is, of course, the goddess of childbirth, which itself bears allusion to death as they're connected in the greater cycle of life. So these correlations offer us some symbolic clues on our own Pluto luminary journey, perhaps as a kind of guide in the process or an indication of where the luminaries actually thrive in these realms despite being out of their element. So in this journey, the luminary answers a request or a demand to enter the underworld, which means that light descends below the horizon to a place where the sun doesn't shine. The function of a light is to illuminate or offer visibility. And we know that the moon's light, of course, comes and goes in its cycles. But in Pluto's domain, the light cannot illuminate. The luminary has to find a different way to see, or it has to see in the dark. At least what is illuminated is below ground. It's not going to be visible to the average everyday eye. There's this element of invisibility that we talked about. In the sky, the sun and the moon also have the most regular rhythms out of all the celestial bodies. So this means that they correspond with a predictable sense of order that is visible to our day-to-day experience. There's a really comforting and mundane nature to the sun and the moon. And though they are both cyclical, which of course is seasonal for the sun and in terms of the visibility cycle for the moon, both the sun and the moon always move forward and have no retrograde movement in the sky. So I don't think we like the disruption or change in our forward-oriented rhythm and perception that comes from a luminary having to descend into unstable ground. Meanwhile, physically, Pluto has the most unusual orbit, and it even sometimes crosses inside Neptune's orbit and gets a little closer to the sun than even Neptune. So we can infer that a Pluto process is always going to take us into uncharted or unusual territory, which is outside of the regular routine rhythms of life that the sun and moon represent. As the furthest planet from the sun, Pluto, and as far in either direction as any planet could be from both the moon and Earth, we can also infer that a Pluto process will span all realms of our experience and life, as it encapsulates the whole distance in which all the other planets and themes of our lives exist. So the process becomes about getting comfortable with Pluto's realms, which is an inherently uncomfortable place. Pluto's realms correspond with the hidden, the tortured, the desirous, passionate, hungry, insatiable, lusty, secretive, powerful, dominating, penetrating aspects. And these become illuminated or more visible or seen by the light as the luminary descends down there. And it also becomes about our journey on the surface, losing light. You know, those paths that we were so devoted to, that we thought were just straight ahead, suddenly becoming tossed into something that is like a dark night of the soul, or not being able to see our habitual way forward in the way that we usually do. The sun tends to signify our path in astrology, and the moon tends to signify our habits and comfort. And so imagine what it is, or remember from your own experience what it is, for these to suddenly be cast into darkness. This is where the luminary is answering some kind of deeper call, because where something will be lost, we must restore something new in its place. This is where Pluto can break down our patterns. We cannot go about the usual way if it is not lit up, if the rhythmic luminary is tossed into the underworld. The underworld is essentially a place of renewal. It's where souls go after death, waiting for their return. So renewal is therefore something that happens in the dark or unseen. They are sacred mysteries that we cannot fully speak into visibility, but we might feel acutely in our lived experience. It is also a private place. So this really becomes its own kind of womb, a dark place that we reside in before a rebirth. And the great discomfort of a Pluto luminary transit is to have something illuminated that generally lives invisibly, even often from our own conscious awareness. Hence the processes of the deep psyche that correspond with Pluto that we often don't even know are occurring. So as I spoke about, the sun and the moon are the light in both skies, the day sky and the night sky. They represent illumination, visibility, warmth and growth, a sense of self and identity, connection, life and the thriving of life, and pathways to greater life. We also understand that the sun and the moon are the right and the left eye. So they represent both our physical as well as our spiritual vision and illumination. Apollo and Artemis's story as the sun and moon shows the will to live, the promise that life will be born and will grow in even the most dire circumstances. Life will find a way. Meanwhile, Hades' story shows the promise of death and loss are just as inevitable. The underworld is a persistent promise and presence in all myth, though it is usually only alluded to or something visited in an initiatory way as a means to deepen a journey or precede a new birth. So invisibility is both a gift and a tool here. The power of the darkness is to initiate new life, a place of reverence to be visited sometimes just for the sake of it, or for the sake of your journey, not even always towards any particular end. And all the references to death and the underworld there are as well that touch the blinding light of Apollo and Artemis's stories and divinity. So when the lights are touched by the underworld, we might say we are invited to let the light go into the darkness. The helmet of invisibility is removed, but not by leaving the underworld, by fully arriving into it. Our normal means of living and perceiving are cast into shadow, and the path ahead is no longer illuminated. Instead, we have to cultivate new vision and learn to see in the dark. Persistent life and persistent death look each other in the eye here. The comforting routine luminaries signify structure and visibility and order in the case of the sun, intuition, comfort, and feeling in the case of the moon. And these comforts are cast into darkness when we get into Pluto's realm. Or, like the Cyclopes, these states of vision become merged in a state of oneness. And the gifts that arise from this merging, like the gifts of the Cyclopes, serve all realms of our experience, not just the heroic ones or the ones that feel nice. In this merging, we see that the light is most vivid when it is cast into darkness, most profound. Life becomes most electric and has a kind of beautiful urgency to it when it is held in the underworld and touched by the vastness of loss. So I believe that there are 3 stages to this kind of journey. And of course, if Pluto is touching one of the luminaries by transit, we might feel these 3 stages more archetypally. But for those who have it as a natal placement, you might consider that you are always cycling through or moving through these 3 stages, or that, perhaps one of them tends to be most relevant to you as a kind of natal promise. In Greek myth, a journey down to the underworld is known as katabasis, which translates to go down. It's considered a heroic journey to be able to enter the underworld still alive and also return. So it's a quote unquote hero's journey to do that. The katabasis is generally followed by anabasis, which means going up, as a living hero generally does not stay in the realm of the dead. In this journey, one must also pass Hades' dog, Cerberus, which is known as a 3-headed dog. And these 3 heads may indicate the 3 archetypal stages of a Pluto journey. or also perhaps mirror what is often 3 exact conjunctions or aspects that happen during a transit. Although I think it's of note that with Pluto, sometimes there are 4 or 5 because it spends so long in each degree of the zodiac. And it really depends on the station degrees with its retrograde movement. So I would attribute these 3 stages to be what I call the descent, the synthesis, and the integration. And we can take Apollo and Artemis's story as a kind of example of these 3 stages. The descent process comes with fear and delays. There's uncertainty about whether the birth will even be possible at all. Leto is banished from all places in Greece. She's banished from solid ground. She's turned away from and invisibilized. A regular experience of life in this descent stage is no longer possible. And importantly, that is usually not happening by choice. The descent is like a summons or something that, becomes circumstantially enforced through experience. A way must be made during the descent where there was no way before. A path has to be carved without seeing where it leads. And then we reach the synthesis. And in their story, the synthesis is the profound magic of twin births becoming possible where it should have been absolutely impossible. It is also the fact that Artemis is born with just the gifts needed to support the birth of her brother, whose presence and light then becomes one of the greatest gifts known to the Olympian gods. It is also the ability for Leto to give birth despite impossible circumstance, or perhaps in some ways because of them, facing trials that were not her choosing, but in which she still finds her power. And then we have to integrate the journey, and that's the 3rd stage. Integration is the growth of Apollo and Artemis into 2 of the most powerful gods there are after this deeply unstable initiation into life. Artemis becomes a goddess of childbirth and midwifery, of thresholds and cycles, marked by the profound gifts of her own harrowing birth experience. Meanwhile, Apollo is gifted with bright light and song that comes out of a banished or delayed origin. This struggle to emerge then integrated as the kind of brightest emergence. So for those of you with Pluto luminary aspects natally, it might be interesting to consider where these 3 stages live in your own birth experience itself. What was your actual birth moment like? And how your life journey has become an integration or a kind of promise of that. So the first stage of the journey, the descent, is like an adjustment period. It's like when it goes dark and your eyes have to adjust to the dark. And there's that feeling where it's actually harder to see at dusk in the twilight than it is in total pitch black. In the descent, we may still be grasping at our familiar lives as we descend. Again, this is often not by choosing. And then the second stage, the synthesis, the heart of the underworld, is like having the helm of darkness both donned and removed at the same time. This is a critical moment, often when we reach the true heart or catalyst of the larger journey. And this happens in the most hidden or invisible place in our experience and in our psyche, where the notion of becoming invisible requires a complete letting go of our average mundane experience of life, losing touch with our usual path. And perhaps here we start to touch aspects of ourself, of our culture, of our reality that tend to remain invisible or that others choose not to see. We start to see something we didn't see before. So this moment of greatest invisibility also becomes a moment of great illumination. Something new is visible. And in the surrender and acceptance of grief and loss, new synthesis becomes possible. And then the 3rd stage is the ascent or the integration. It feels very important to say that the integration is not just a leaving behind and moving on. We have acquired a new way of vision. perceived something that was previously darkened and invisible, and this cannot be unseen. So as we begin to ascend and return to the surface and to our quote unquote regular reality, we come charged with new wisdom and perception that others are often unable to or uninterested to look at. And now it is our duty to carry that forward into the world. So I'm going to move to just looking at a couple examples now. Rosa Parks is one of my favorite examples of so many things in astrology. And so I'm going to take her as an example here of a Pluto moon journey. I'm sure most people know her name, but for those of you who don't, Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist during US segregation, who was best known for not giving up her seat on a Montgomery bus to a white person. She was a Black woman. This prompted the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted over a year and led to a court-mandated decision that bus segregation goes against constitutional rights. And, you know, if you look at her year of birth, obviously during her lifetime, slavery itself had been abolished in the US almost a century before. But of course, slavery, forced labor, and deeply systemic racism continued, much of it still to this day. So there are many interesting aspects of her chart that I will resist the urge to talk about. She's such a beautiful expression of so many things. But for our purposes, we're going to be looking at the moon and Pluto here. So she has the moon in Capricorn, more or less on her ascendant, and then Pluto in Gemini in the 6th house. And, you know, for the sake of curiosity, we might also note in the background that there's a sign-based applying trine between her Sun in Aquarius and Pluto in Gemini. So this is an aversion, or what some people would refer to as an inconjunct. It's not a classical aspect, but I think her story is so powerful, and we'll see by transit that there's a kind of natal promise to the aversion here that comes to light later in her life. For me, the aversion between the moon and Pluto represents a kind of removal of the helmet of invisibility. Aversions are uncomfortable. We're trying to get at something that we can't actually see. And so the fulfillment of her natal promise of that is in some ways about using disruptive visibility to generate a kind of meaningful change. And I also think it represents a kind of liberation for those who are forced into the underworld. Pluto in her 6th indicates her civil rights activism, and the moon on her ascendant promises the importance of her role as well as her capacity to lead with her heart. The moon in Capricorn, of course, also takes great emotional responsibility for the care of others. And interesting to note also that in traditional astrology, the moon is taken to signify the people, or, you know, the kind of common people or the group of people traditionally. So the moon on her ascendant also foregrounds her responsibility to the people in her life and her community. I would say that the moon on her ascendant gives her an Artemis or midwife kind of life. The way that Artemis must first facilitate her own birth before she helps her brothers, and also that their births happen in a kind of banished or invisible place. Of course, noting that Rosa has the moon in detriment as well as and several other planets in detriment. And Artemis becomes the goddess of childbirth out of that experience, midwifing countless other beings into the world in a way that I think Rosa symbolically does for Black Americans. It's truly a moon-Pluto aspect that shines a light into the underworld, creating visibility on the realms that have been relegated into darkness and pain, often, as I mentioned, you know, without choice. We might say also that her moon in detriment, you know, to be a little technical about it, is in a malefic enclosure, meaning that it's separating from the planet Mars and applying next to the planet Saturn. And then also in that aversion to Pluto. And this in many ways represents a kind of ongoing descent process that Rosa's journey signifies. So of the 3 stages of the journey, I would say that the natal promise of Rosa's chart has a kind of ongoing descent-like quality to it. So this is the chart or the estimated chart of Rosa refusing to give up her seat on the bus. And, I tried to do a little research. 6 p.m. is an estimated time. So I'm just noting that because obviously it's a 29-degree ascendant. It is possible that the ascendant of this chart is Cancer. But I think the 29-degree Gemini ascendant would be interesting if it's accurate, and I'll come back to that in a moment. That ascendant in this chart would also be receiving a sextile from Pluto over here in late Leo, indicating Pluto's presence and importance in this moment. Although if the time is a little later, the moon would be on the ascendant in Cancer, which is like a reiteration of her natal chart, although obviously the moon in Cancer has a little more dignity than it does in Capricorn. So here's the bi-wheel where we have Rosa's natal chart at the center, and then the chart of that moment on the outside. And I know there's some people signed up that are not themselves astrologers. So don't worry if this looks like total hieroglyphics. We'll try to talk about the symbols of it. So here we can actually see that if the late Gemini ascendant is accurate, it's right on her natal Pluto in the 6th, with the transiting moon at 11 Cancer, very close to her descendant at 19 Cancer. And also the transiting moon is making a trine to her midheaven in Scorpio there. Meanwhile, the presence of transiting Pluto at 28 Leo creates a yod shape. So for those of you who are not familiar, it's like a double aversion. We have Pluto in Leo and Pluto in Gemini in a double aversion with her moon, which forms the shape of what we call a yod. So this yod is like the doubling of her natal moon Pluto aversion that she has, which might indicate or emphasize a moment that brings her to some kind of synthesis, like the heart of an underworld journey, that synthesis moment. So we might say that while her natal chart has this kind of descent-like promise to it, this beautiful moment of action on the bus is the synthesis of her underworld journey. In the heart of the loss and the journey that she and other Black Americans faced, she addresses the invisibilizing of Black Americans and illuminates their existence, their rights, and their lives. The Montgomery bus boycott and the ending of that aspect of segregation might then represent this integration stage of the process that we looked at. So there's a long, slow process of journeying back from the underworld that we might say we're still in, taking what has been illuminated in its heart and bringing it back to the surface of average life so that it informs the path forward. This is a beautiful story of how the acknowledgement of grief and loss and casting light on the underworld of human experience can actually initiate a rebirth, facilitating a journey out of the underworld itself. And there's a merging of the cyclopes-like vision that takes both the acknowledgement of the underworld and the persistent promise that new life will find a way. So just briefly, I'd like to also look at the chart of Tim Burton, who is a really great Sun-Pluto example. And I'm sure many of you know Tim Burton as an American film creator, known for his films like Beetlejuice, Nightmare Before Christmas, Edward Scissorhands, several of the Batman movies, and myself as a young goth, I was a deep lover of Tim Burton.
Hi, Erin. Let me just pop in really quickly and let you know that it is 11 o'clock. So if you wouldn't mind going through this one really quickly, we have a couple questions. And if people are willing to stay on for a few more minutes, we'll go to 11:15 at the latest. Okay. Sorry, Erin. I'll let you get back. I just wanted to give you a time check.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. So I'm going to blast through some of my points here, and then I'll move to my conclusion. So basically, you will want to note that he has an exact Sun-Pluto conjunction in Virgo in the fourth house, which quite literally indicates him shining a light on the macabre, the dark fantastical realms, essentially creating his own goth aesthetic and genre within film. Tim described his childhood as being lonely and difficult, even spending a lot of his time in a nearby cemetery. Again, fascinating for the fourth house sun Pluto, because I mentioned that Apollo rules over cemeteries and tombs. So here's a quote from him. He says, "Growing up, I had these two windows in my room, nice windows that looked out onto the lawn. And for some reason, my parents walled them up and gave me this little slit window that I had to climb up on a desk to see out of." So quite literally, the light went out. And again, Sun Pluto in the fourth house, indicating his family home, his home of origin, and being sealed in a room without light is the most evocative Sun Pluto image I could imagine. So we might say that he lives more in a moment of synthesis, whereas Rosa lived in a kind of descent. And he's also self-diagnosed with autism and neurodivergence, which, while I don't believe that's inherently a kind of underworld marking, his upbringing in quite a normal suburban American environment tells us that that probably felt like a kind of alienation for him in and of itself. So these passages of time, or perhaps our whole lives for some of us, where we lose the habitual light of our everyday life and must descend into darkness, where we must meet aspects of self and other that have been frozen or lost through trauma or history, can be some of the most profound experiences of our lives. And as always, we have choice with what we do with those initiatory tendencies and times. Like the souls on the river Styx, sometimes we do not know how, or we fear the way, and we become stuck in between. And one thing that I have learned is that it is never too late for synthesis or integration. Our acceptance of the darkness and our willingness to peer into it with curiosity and openness, and even love, if we can, becomes a profoundly altering way of life, even just for a period of time. So while the underworld is a place of death, it is often not a place of finite endings, nor is a Pluto journey. Instead, it represents a kind of fertile ground for life to find a way, and perhaps a different way. And this new way allows a raw, vivid, terrifying, profoundly beautiful honesty and integration of the full realms of our experience. Like the Cyclopes, we experience a state of merged vision where we might learn to both see in the dark and also by the light of day. Grief can become a skill and a companion, like the many rivers that lead in and out of the underworld. Our tears and deep feeling become the passageways along which we travel and are no longer stuck or frozen or lost in the liminal states. So I will leave you with a quote from the beautiful Frances Weller, who says, "I'm not sure how or when I began my apprenticeship with sorrow. I do know that it was my gateway back into the breathing and animate world. It was through the dark waters of grief that I came to touch my unlived life. There is some strange intimacy between grief and aliveness, some sacred exchange between what seems unbearable and what is most exquisitely alive. Through this, I have come to have a lasting faith in grief." So that feels like a beautiful summary of Pluto and the luminaries to me.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Erin. You got lots of comments of people saying how much they appreciated your presentation and how bright and brilliant you were. Just a couple questions here that we'll finish on. One, is there a Rodham rating for the Rosa Parks natal chart?
Yes, and I forget what it is, but it's a high rating.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right. I
that
think
was
that I've seen
I've
it
checked.
enough times too that I believe that it's accurate.
Yes.
Okay, so this is okay, another quick question, and then we'll go to the longer question, and then we'll probably wrap up. I'm just curious as to what orbs you use for Pluto and the luminary aspects.
Um, if we're talking about Pluto by transit, I think it is most important to pay attention to the exact degree.
Mm.
However, I would give up to 5 degrees within sign for like a kind of process orb. And I'd say you're gonna really feel it around 2 or 3 degrees, probably.
Okay. All right. And so this is the question that a couple people had. Would you please speak to some of the potential subtle differences between different aspects of the luminary, such as Pluto conjunction, opposition, square, trine, etc.? So just really, what are the different flavors that that you've seen, you've noticed?
Yeah, I purposely left that out because it feels like such a huge, I wanted to give people more like a symbol to work with. But I would say a conjunction is emerging. So there's going to be some aspect of the self or identity that gets merged with the identity of Pluto. Whereas a square is often like a circumstance that must be overcome. So it's something that often gets introduced, that there's a digestion or overcoming. And in opposition, I find them to be like guardians at the gateway. Like an opposition from Pluto is like to further incarnate into your own life, you must first pass through the gateways. And so there's a kind of going through process. So that's my very brief synopsis.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I know that people got a lot out of this. I personally love the mythology, so thank you so much. And again, everyone, please tune in next month for the Mercury Hour, and please do consider becoming an OPA member if you are not already. So this will be sent out. The recording will be sent out, and it will be posted on YouTube if you would like to come back and revisit it again. So thank you all for your time and have a lovely Sunday.
Coming, everyone.